Oh, can I share my screen, Disha? Is that okay?
Yep, absolutely.
Oh, there we go. All right. So I wanted to share with you today because I feel like story is so important to root us in two of the projects that I've been blessed and honored to be a part of over the last few years, where I feel like trust-based philanthropy is a fully saturated approach by the board members, by the fundraisers, by the funders, by the communities, by the participants, by everyone, clients that surround the work. And I share these with you today because I think that it's really important to root in an understanding of what this work really looks like and feels like. Um, I went to the website of the Tarsadia Foundation, and I loved the quote that I saw from your organization up there from Mahatma Gandhi, basically about how much of this is how we approach the work. It's how we make people feel. It's the intangible, small, silent elements of the work that may never end up in a spreadsheet or an annual report, right? It's those things that we do surrounding the actual mechanisms and technical aspects of grant making and resource mobilizing and all of that that really are at the root of trust-based philanthropy. So here is a picture of my good colleagues and friends, a group of BIPOC midwives in Detroit, Michigan, in the United States, who really have inspired me as a fundraiser to think about the new and different conversations that we have with partners and with donors as we move through this work, to create, organizations and movements that have never been seen before. Turns out nobody's lived in December of 2023. After everything that we've been through this year, post pandemic, post global reckonings, and all the things that we've been through as a global human family, and known exactly what is the right path forward. But with trust and right relationship, we can do that. And so I love Birth Detroit and share this today as an example of, again, a couple of years ago, folks told the leaders of this organization that there was no way they would raise $4 million, $5 million to open and own and operate Detroit's first freestanding BIPOC-led, owned, and operated birth center. And yet they have not only broken ground, but they're also opening in June and will be catching babies next summer. So what's really exciting about this for me is that the impossible is possible when we lean into trust-based philanthropy, when we reimagine the definition of risk. And I just kind of pulled up three of the things that, again, very tangibly, most of the contributions to this project were multi-year, unrestricted, we believe in you, go and build it type of gifts. The other was support beyond the check. In order to open a birth center in Michigan, there were a lot of policy levers that needed to be moved and political capital that needed to be organized. Those relationships that were brokered, those introductions that were made, those conversations that were had. Again, those aren't necessarily things that we track on either side of our work, but those are the cups of coffee or the walking in the park conversations that lead to real change. And then I just always like to lift up the heart and love capital. Just having a community of people resourcing you and supporting you and believing in you is so important. And similar, just to share another organization as well, having now served, I've worn many hats at Creative Action Institute. I'm a donor there. I've been on the board. I was a fundraiser for them. And in wearing all of those hats, when they launched the East African Girls Leadership Summit in East Africa, I remember, again, very similarly, the conversations had with donors and how it was really important for us to be very transparent that this was a risk to launch a new initiative like this. And so I think it was really critical for us to be in a position where on both sides we were saying, hey, we're in a grand experiment. And again, as we talk about the framework of trust-based philanthropy today, it allows many of these experiments to be able to flourish and thrive and give us information for the future. Nothing is a loss as we move forward together. And also the big part of this was there was a ton of support beyond the check. There were, again, relationships brokered, organizations that collaborated with us. There was a whole ecosystem built because of the way in which funders showed up in the work with us that allowed us to not only explore it, but to be sustainable and very close to this organization's 10th anniversary of this particular summit and program. And again, just the heart and love capital makes a big difference when people email you on December 31st and say, hey, I've been watching, keep at it, let us know what you need, you're doing amazing work. So as we approach that end of the year kind of time and moment, I think it's important to also just lift that piece of the work up. So I'm just going to leave these on the screen here. I will not speak through all of them because who likes a presenter who reads their slides verbatim? Hopefully they're a tool, right? And today is all about tools. But as you explore the Trust-Based Philanthropy website, learn more about the history and where it came from, it really is rooted in this core set of values. And for me, I've always been in the philanthropic sector because at some point I'd like to put myself out of business in some capacity, right? Like moving forward to being in a position where we don't have to be as reliant on philanthropy because we've gotten in right relationship with organizations. We can all focus on sort of moving in right relationship to each other. Communities can thrive. There can be a balance of power and real equity in our communities. And I think, part of that also, as we just talked about today, and why I'm so excited to have these partners here, is that you have to see this as a consistent learning journey. You have to always be able to root in this concept of embracing learning and figuring out at what point which lever gets pulled and pushed, and also to show up as a real collaborator. Right? So thinking about how we collaborate and come together, how we are a collective in this work, and really focus on the idea that our collective liberation, the world that is better for all of us, is rooted in seeing and hearing each other. And so those are so many of the practices of trust-based philanthropy that we'll dive more into today. And just to get really tangible, and for those of you who like a checklist, these are some of the things that I look at on a consistent basis, not only as a fundraiser or a donor, but also as just a volunteer or an ambassador, or someone who's watching, and witnessing certain movements. I got my start in Eastern Europe. I lived in Belgrade, Serbia, and was part of some peace building and reconciliation work at that time, and still connected to some communities there. And so for me, I even go back to thinking about those early days in my social change trajectory and looking at the organizations I supported 15, almost 20 years ago now, and thinking about how they are both inspiring these conversations as an organization, but also how their funders are showing up to support them, or their partners are showing up to support them in this way. So the first kind of tenet of trust-based philanthropy is multi-year unrestricted giving, being able to give in a way that allows people to focus on decades and generational change, and not just calendar year to calendar year, and really thinking about what that support looks like, because again, it's really rooted in learning and listening together and being responsive to the needs of a community, which, as we all know, reflecting on a year right now, a year goes by pretty quickly. And so being able to really think about, again, multi-year giving in that kind of way. Donors doing their homework. So again, one of the ways to eliminate power dynamics is not to put it all on the backs of the education or the community or the movement leaders, to share that information with you, which sometimes can be really harmful. I've worked with a lot of grassroots leaders who time and time again have to share their stories and what's happened in their community in a way that is very triggering and re-traumatizing and undignified. And so finding ways in which we can do the storytelling, we can share the information, and having funders really take on doing that work. So it's not up to the communities as much to share exactly what's going on. And also to do your homework in terms of understanding the movements and the ecosystems and what's possible. So researching and getting to know other organizations and doing your own ecosystem building as a funder or funding entity. Simplifying and streamlining paperwork. So again, I'm excited to have the Tarsadia Foundation and Maya here, because I think they're a stellar example of the process, the technical end of this and what it actually looks like. So excited for that question today. And then the last three, being transparent and responsive, being really honest and upfront about what resources are accessible, what timeframes look like, benchmarks, impact reporting, what all of that looks like, and also what all of that looks like in relationship. Soliciting and acting on feedback. So again, being willing to have an open communication, and again, that builds trust. Open communication and feedback loop, so that again, you're eliminating power dynamics and really seeing and hearing folks on both sides of the relationship. And then lastly is offering support beyond the check. So again, this real polycapital approach of going beyond it just being about financial resources, but all of the other ways in which we can support movements. And often again are those intangible, small, silent things that we're doing as funders or partners or ambassadors on behalf of the causes we care about. So here's the big question today as we dive into exploring it. I'm sure many of you on today's call are wearing several of these hats, and are in these different roles, but what does this trust-based philanthropy movement mean for fundraisers, resource mobilizers, volunteer leaders, board members, and ambassadors? social entrepreneurs and funders themselves. So I'm going to stop my screen share. Thank you all for listening. I appreciate it. And I'm going to shift to introducing our awesome panelists today. I'm going to let everyone do a little bit of a self-introduction because I think it's really important to hear from each of you sort of the context within which you're coming to this conversation with the Catalyst 2030 group today. But I will just share that we are so lucky to have Rakiba Kibria of Common Future, Maya Patel of the Tarsadia Foundation, and Vishal Kapoor from Dasra here, and all of them wearing many of these hats over the course of their careers, all of them rooted in this idea of this work being a learning journey and about true partnership, and all of them being lifelong ambassadors, very committed to the organizations and the movements that they serve. So with that, Rakiba, can I call you in first to share a little bit about your work today?
Of course. Thank you so much, Alyssa. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to folks in so many various time zones. I am Rakiba, she, her. I'm currently the Vice President of Revenue at Common Future. But even more than that, Alyssa, I love how you started with the human self. So I am a mom, soon to be mom of two, a lifelong learner. I hail from refugees and liberation fighters from Bangladesh, and I live in New York City, Queens, and I rep Queens hard. So that's a little bit about me and how I show up and bring myself to the work. But more than that, I've been just added to that, I've been a career fundraiser for 15 years. I don't think anyone wants to ever be a career fundraiser, mobilizing resources for nonprofits big and small in New York City and nationally. And currently, like I mentioned, with Common Future, we're an intermediary in the space, investing in community solutions that power racial justice and economic equity in the United States. And I've raised along philanthropic capital to debt and investment for our community partners, and have practiced trust-based philanthropy firsthand, and have also witnessed and been burnt by inequitable fundraising and inequitable practices throughout my career as a woman of color. So I'm hoping to bring all of those lenses and my full self to this conversation today, and I'm so excited to be with you all here. Can I pass it to Maya?
Yeah, go right ahead.
Hi, everyone. Again, welcome and thank you for having me. We are a family foundation. My parents started the foundation in about the 2000s, and we really did not have a huge mission or really knew what we were doing. We just took a course of learning and experimenting, and it's been a beautiful journey. We've met some amazing people along the way, and our foundation really focuses on inclusive mobility, health and human services, equity, a lot of things that are pillars for us that really kind of help us and guide us to what we want to do. But as a personally, I'm also a mother of four girls, and that's my joy and my life. I absolutely adore them, and it's really helped me be a good role model for them and to expose them to the different things that are happening around the world. And I think this platform is a wonderful place for not only this time period, but for what's to come in the next generation. And I'm really trying to bring them forward as well. So our foundation is really just absorbing, learning, and we're here to share the ways that we've done things, but in all times, we're not any experts at any of this. So I'm amongst a lot of people that I think have a lot of expertise and experience, and I'm excited to talk to you all today.
Thank you,
I'll
Maya.
pass it to Patel.
Thanks, Maya. Thank you all for being here for this masterclass session. My name is Vishal Kapoor. I represent an organization called Dasra that's been in existence for almost 25 years. Next year is our big 25th year anniversary, which is exciting. I've been at Dasra for a little over 13 years, and we're a philanthropy foundation based out of Mumbai, India, that for the last 24 years has been trying to develop a culture of strategic giving in India. And so we do a lot of mobilizing resources, raising funds, influencing philanthropy towards different cause areas that we build collaboratives around. And so given just the unique aspects of India's philanthropic ecosystem. For the last 24 years, we've played a collective impact role in trying to orchestrate different collaboratives, align agendas, bring these multiple stakeholders together around specific cause areas, from empowering adolescents to urban sanitation, climate resilience, most recently during COVID, towards relief and then resilience building for grassroots civil society. Um, and so we currently run 8 such collaboratives, and one of which is called the Rebuild India Fund, and is something that we've co-launched and partnered with the Tarsadia Foundation on. And a lot of we've been striving to imbibe and practice all aspects of the trust-based philanthropy journey and principles that Alyssa spoke about earlier. And so it's from that program that I'll try and draw a lot of our learnings, insights, also share what we're doing in a tangible way that hopefully others can take away and find it useful. But excited to be here. I'm dialing in from Oakland, California, where I live with my wife and our daughter, who's 5.5, and we've just moved back here after living in India for the last many years. So still settling in, and really, really excited to be here. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. I feel like we're going to have some parenting and philanthropy analogies that come in of going through the portal and down the path in the world that we're living in, for sure. So I want to just start with a question of each panelist, and then we'll get into some specific questions for each organization. But I want to ask this higher level question of what you do differently since you've really kind of deepened into trust-based philanthropy, or what you see your organization or some of the funders and partners and grantees around you doing differently since this trust-based philanthropy framework exists. And then also would be curious how it's a tool for you to kind of monitor and evaluate what you're doing as an organization or an entity. So I don't know, Maya, if it's okay for me to turn to you first with that question.
Sure. I think for us, we really didn't even know we were doing trust-based philanthropy. For us, it was a very organic, and those values were something that we had just learned and started embedding into our work. It wasn't planned. We didn't even know what this term was. For us, it's sort of that way. And we were very happy that, a lot of our portfolio has shifted to multi-year unrestricted, all of the things that are important in the tenets of the principles. It was not a conscious choice. It just was organic. And so for us, it hasn't been difficult. It was just a very fluid transition. I think when we spoke with Dasra about doing this rebuild fund, that's when all of the terminology and all of the concepts started coming in, when we thought, okay, well, how do we really capitalize on this? How do we make it work so that we can influence so much of the other part of our portfolio? And I think that's taking place now. It hasn't converted completely. And I think that's probably something that takes time. As an organization, as a fundraiser, or as a foundation, we are having those conversations, and we're talking about it more, and we're strategizing into how do we bake in this long-term giving throughout all of our portfolios. And sometimes I have to say that, when you have partners like Dasra, or you have collaboratives, it's easier. It makes it much more fluid, and that's the process that makes it easier for us. So some of our one-time grant making is difficult to convert that, and I think that's the part that we're still learning and experiencing.
And I just want to add to that too. So I've been on the receiving end of trust-based philanthropic relationships, being a fundraiser and mobilizing resources for community partners, big and small. What trust-based philanthropy has done at its core is provided intentionality and mutual accountability to the work, because the framework's right there, right? And you have the 6 principles guiding that framework. But what I want to mention as well is, long before the framework was formalized, codified, and practiced, there were many funders that were practicing trust-based philanthropy in their day-to-day, and many fundraisers as well. And that was deeply rooted in relationship building. It was deeply rooted in seeing program officers, institutions, high net worth family donors as the people they are and the good work that they want to do and partner with together with nonprofit partners, and philanthropy as a way of expressing those values and those strategies that they want to come together around, right? Trust-based philanthropy has been beautiful in but really, again, enforcing that mutual accountability, setting that intention, and also allowing fundraisers young, new to their career journey, or caught in the power dynamics of it all, to name and live into a framework that has been adopted by many reputable funders and practitioners in the ecosystem. So it's signaled to the ecosystem of resource and capital mobilization that, hey, we can do this differently. It can and should always be rooted in deep relationships. And even when fundraisers and nonprofits are not explicitly naming power dynamics or extractive practices, policies, and culture, you yourself as a funder have to do that analysis and figure out, are we practicing this? Are we really hoarding resources and being inequitable? Or are we in it for the long game of being in the right relationship with our funding partners and grant recipients? How do we make that even more equitable and even deeper and rich towards the collective impact we want to create?
I love that, Rakiba. And I know Vishal, knowing Dasra's work over the years, I'm curious if you can speak a little bit to that relational piece, and like how that looks in juxtaposition to this movement, but also, again, my understanding of Dasra is you've been working in this way before even the movement and the platform was kind of launched and there was a framework. But so again, curious if you want to share a little bit about your roots and then how you use it as a tool now that it's been more formalized and you're talking with new and different partners.
Sure, thanks, Alyssa. Yeah, we've experimented with different giving vehicles, philanthropic vehicles to channelize more philanthropy, more strategic giving, more impactful giving in India, within India, domestic philanthropy, but also globally into India. With some of these principles, at least the long-term unrestricted funding aspects of it for quite some time. I think for us, really with a lot of Dasra's work, and especially the Rebuild India Fund together with Tarsadia Foundation, COVID was a bit of a game changer, right? It on one hand, so it was, someone once said that, oh, it's there's so much of an awakening because we're all in the same boat. And someone countered that during one of these webinars, which I thought was really poignant, being like, maybe it's more like we were all in the same storm but with very, very different boats. And what we felt at that time, what we saw happening on the ground, was that things were changing so rapidly, and the needs of millions of the most systematically deprived communities were so desperate and changing so quickly. And at that time, it was really grassroots civil society, those closest to those communities. And who do those tend to be? Those are members of those communities themselves, right? Community-based leaders, community-based organizations, or proximate leaders, if we might call them that really stepped up and started to help save lives. And what we realize is that these principles of giving allow you to support them better, right? And so, we realize that to work in an environment that's extremely diverse, where there's, a lot of the issues are at scale, like philanthropy cannot run in this command and control manner, right? It has to be decentralized. It has to be more trusting. The minute you want to, you want to go out there and support what's happening in different areas, you need to trust those who don't look and feel and speak like you, right? And so that's like what becomes interesting about the relational and the trust part. It is everyone approaches philanthropy, I feel, with a certain level of trust, but with trust-based philanthropy, it's trusting stuff that you may not have trusted before, right? It's that unlearning. And I think the relational aspect there is that once you start, not just supporting proximate leaders, but getting proximate in your philanthropy, i.e., getting to know them as human beings, getting to understand what their needs are, when you start as a funder doing that, you start to quickly realize, well, a lot of these principles make immense sense, right? It's just the way you got to do it, because the needs are changing, and you're not living thousands of miles away, going to be able to respond as efficiently, as nimbly, to the community's needs, as you might want to. And so all the principles, I feel, Alyssa, that you mentioned so neatly earlier on in the presentation, once you get proximate with your philanthropy, they all start to make sense. And for Dasra now, we've had to like double click and really, with the Rebuild India Fund, focus on specific aspects way more than we've done before, including reducing the burden on organizations and the paperwork. I think we're starting to see, with the momentum that, with the structure, the framing, and the more sort of language and momentum that we're seeing behind trust-based philanthropy, it's starting to make certain conversations with donors easier, because it's also sort of the cool thing to do. And there's more leadership in this space from philanthropists domestically, but globally doing this as well, that we can point to as examples. And I think that's making some of the fundraising for this kind of philanthropy easier. Sorry, I know I touched on a few different things and went a little all over the place, but hopefully that's somewhat helpful.
No, it's really helpful. I love that you brought up unlearning. That's like my favorite thing to talk about. And actually, one of the organizations that I love has a page that says, at the top, instead of FAQs, like frequently asked questions about the organization, it says, all the things you will unlearn here, ... to set us all free. And it talks about how they're doing everything a little non-traditional, and what is tradition, rooted in harm, as in many ways, as we all know. But I think that's really like fascinating, that framework of just consistently unlearning and being and exploring. I want to stay with you, Vishal, for this next, because I do think it's part of the work that you're doing, again, is just that sort of, how does all of this fit into the tenet of moving beyond the check? And I also, Rakiba and Maya, I might turn to you around this as well, because I think that moving beyond the check piece, as we saw during the pandemic, yes, resources were helpful, but there was so much that happened, pandemic and now post-pandemic and whatever, this next phase that we are in now. But I'm curious, Vishal, if you can share a little bit around what that tenet looks like for you at Dasra in practice.
Sure. Thanks, Alyssa. Yeah, just to frame it a little bit about, because I'll, mention the Rebuild India Fund a little bit. So I'll just, put down just some boilerplate around what of it, and then I'll draw a little bit on what we're learning and how we're doing it. So, this is a long-term resilience building fund. The idea is to support, to source, identify, and support 500 proximate leaders in India over the next 5 years, provide each of them with 10 lakh Indian rupees or $12,500 of unrestricted funding each year, and make a 5-year commitment to each of them. And also, beyond the unrestricted funds, we organize quarterly capacity and exposure building workshops, right, to build communities of practice and sharing and learning around these organizations, and hopefully some amount of skill building as well. And while doing all of this, obviously try and advocate for more of this kind of philanthropy, towards India. Now, the beyond funding piece, Alyssa, has been part of Dasra's DNA right from when we started, because I think we very quickly realized that money is only one half, or even less than one half of the problem, and the combination of unrestricted funding and needs-based capacity workshops, where you're not mandating it on organizations, they can really opt in, but you're giving exposure and you're saying, well, this is the what and why of fundraising, right? Communications, monitoring, learning, evaluation,
mental health and well-being, right? Building leadership, second line management, all of these like institution building principles, exposing the organizations, helping them reflect on where they think they might need support. And I think the unrestricted funding and the capacity support are then really symbiotic, right? Because of the way philanthropy's been done and the starvation cycle that a lot of these proximate leaders have been sort of socialized into, what we're realizing is once you provide the unrestricted funding and you have conversations around how the organizations want to utilize this funding, whether programmatically, whether for ongoing relief work or for new things, for new innovations, or to invest in themselves, like that is a muscle and a way of thinking that as philanthropy we've almost not encouraged, right? And so now, where the beyond funding support comes in, and the most exciting part is I think you have these organizations starting to flex that muscle, right? And so it's been important for us to try and provide them that exposure to groups who can help them flex that muscle. And then if they want to channel some of their unrestricted funding towards that, that's great. But I think then that starts, you start getting to a space of these leaders feeling like they're taking more control of their own organization's growth. And I think that is super important, and probably one of the most lasting impacts, I think, of the whole trust-based philanthropy movement.
I appreciate that. And Rakiba, it's making me think of common future, because I know you do the capacity building, sort of reimagining elements of the work. So curious what your sort of reactions are to that as well.
Yeah, and reactions. And before I even go into that, the things I want to name is resource mobilization and allocation, and what we know about it, what we practice it, whether in the global north, global south, in communities of color and elsewhere, is really rooted in colonized ways and in Western methodologies, period, And I use like resource mobilization and allocation pretty specifically, and not philanthropy, because each one of us has a culture of philanthropy that we come from. Like I said, I'm an involuntary fundraiser for 15 years. My first job in fundraising, when they asked me to do fundraising campaigns and direct mails, I was just like, this is how you mobilize people with money? Like, you ask them through the mail to give you a check? Like, what was that? Because the culture that I come from, where there's mutual aid and collectivism, right? When you need something, your people are there for you, right? And there's no like kind of emailifying that or a direct mailifying that. So it blew my mind as how fundraising was being done and how rooted it was in just like global north and like Western methodologies, colonial extractive methodologies, right? So when I say that out loud, I'm talking about how Vishal, I'm so glad you named COVID multiple times, because COVID was really the inflection point where we knew the systems that needed to change to build an equitable world and a beautiful planet, ecologically, collectively, and yet we were convinced that we couldn't get there. But all of a sudden, the world caught on fire in multiple realms, right? And we had this urgency to get there, and like, okay, if not now, when? Because we all might be dead. And it happened with collective urgency and expediency that we hadn't seen before. And it was really an inflection point. What that point was for Common Future, and I've been with the organization almost 6 years now, is we realized a lot of the ways in which philanthropy is practiced in the United States was around procedural formalities. When we were working with community partners on the ground that needed to shift their businesses, let's say they were an entrepreneur support organization, an incubator for small businesses, they all of a sudden became a mobile food pantry because half of their community no longer had access to a grocery store or food to provide for their homes, right? We saw these like shifts happening rapidly, and just philanthropy and city contracts and everyone just sit. And we're like, what's happening? So Rodney Foxworth, who was our CEO at that time, literally lockdown happened March 17th for us in the United States. And March 20th, he texted a bunch of the staff members being like, hey, we have a little something in terms of our surpluses as a nonprofit intermediary. I'm just going to make the executive decision to allocate 10% of our operating budget to rapid release, right? And I will get this ratified by the board later. Don't worry about it. And essentially the mandate that he gave to 11 staff members is collectively come around, let's figure out how to deploy. It was $250,000 at that time. Rakiba, figure out if you can raise an additional amount, which became 387. We need to get this out ASAP because community members are suffering in Jackson, Mississippi. Yes, there's a water crisis that we know about right now, right? But the water crisis was ongoing for many, many years, but they didn't even have the means to buy water bottles and have safe water just being, shepherded to their communities. They were like, this is what's needed right now. And how do we get them there? So the mandate was we need to move the money in 7 days. 5-question Google form needs to go out to our network, give them 24 hours or 48 hours to complete it. It shouldn't take them more than 5 minutes to do. We will deliberate how to come about and evaluate and then deploy the micro grants, right? We thought we were going to get maybe about 500,000 in requests. The request came to be 2.5 million. From about 100 community partners, and request on request on request. What we read was so heartbreaking that, hey, our grantor has stopped funding. Hey, our city contract said they won't pay. Hey, we've had to lay off staff. Our staff are now volunteer. Hey, we need to buy groceries. We need to provide food to our community members, but we're slowly running out of cash. And almost 80% of those respondents said they didn't have 30 days of runway. What? So like no emergency savings, right? Like we as people know in personal finance to do. And that blew our minds. That completely blew our minds. Is like, what? So anyhow, we got this going, raised that money, put out about 43 grants or 43 grants out in the span of 5 days. And then we bullhorn mic'd it the next Monday being like, hey, if we are a $2.5 million organization that can do this, what's stopping you? And what we realized, what was stopping Philanthropy was one, the procedural formalities, the back ends of all the things they needed filled out before getting monies out as people were dying. And also, as what the pandemic showed us, the what of our programs, the what of what we do is always going to change in response to the communities that we serve. If the what is continuously changing, what do we have to be rooted in? We have to be rooted in how. How are we mobilizing the resources? How are we allocating? And how are we truly being transformative in the ways that we're thinking about who we value in the community, the risks that we take? And one of the things that we say at Common Future, and it's plastered on my wall, is, and in order to change the how, you got to change the who. You got to interrogate who's doing the work, who's being centered, who's being left out, what are we mobilizing, how are we doing it, and who are the people that are actually in these spaces, in these relationships, and have access to these resources that otherwise wouldn't. And that's truly kind of been how I've practiced, thought about, just trust-based philanthropy. And I hope I answered your question, Alyssa. I don't know if I did.
I think it's really good too, as we're moving through today, with all the folks trying to just have these real tangible examples of like, we did it. We proved that it can be done, because I think that's the other thing too, is I've gotten pushback when I've sent the tenants to different funders or partners or organizations of sort of like, well, we don't really know if that's realistic, like that all those things can happen. But you're sort of like, again, I think COVID and that entire year and where we are now proved so many of those things are possible. And I think, Maya, I want to honor what Rakiba said about the formal processes and how that is such a Western way of going about it. I know in your work, you've really tried to support moving away from some of those formalities and processes and procedures. So I don't know if you can share a little bit around that, because I did want to ask you about your sort of paperwork process today, because it does make a big difference when it's efficient. And it also, like Rakiba said, addresses the real urgency that people are dying and the planet is suffering and we need to move resources.
Yeah, I think, it's a great segue, because I do feel we were in the same position. Like, how can we get more resources out? What are we doing? And for us, it was the why. Like, what are we waiting for? What's holding us back? And that's what launched Rebuild for us. But I think for our simplification of the process is we request an NOI, and it's usually through partnerships or through relationships or through people that we've talked to and know in the community. And it's a very simple one form sort of thing, and send it in and we'll talk about it. And then we'll get on a phone call and talk about what the needs are. And we really realize that we don't have the answers. We have absolutely no idea what's going on in different parts of the world. And even in our communities that are, even though we do the research, even though we have to do the due diligence, we still don't know. We'll never possibly have all the answers. So we look upon all of the community members to give us that information. And we look for leadership. Leadership is important to us, because then we know that we're putting the trust in them, and okay, let's help them build up whatever they need to do. And that capacity building grant has to go there. It has to be a general operating. We don't want to talk about programs anymore, because we don't really know, what the need is at that given time. So for simplification, it's one form. We have them bring that in. We make a very quick decision, very quick turnaround, and we give them the answer right away, and after that, the evaluation form is also once a year. It's either by a few questions, or it's a phone call again. Okay, how are you doing? What do you need? Did this work? Did this not work? And it has helped us, because we don't need to, what are we going to do with all that paperwork? What are we going to do with all the report? What are we going to do with all that if I don't have somebody to look at it, and to understand it, and to be in that frame of mind to understand and extract this information. So that's the learning that we've had, is like, we don't need the reports. We don't need all that information until and unless it's actually needed to move us forward into the next phase. So that's a very simple answer, but that's what we do.
Yeah. I'm going to add one more thing too, because I realized I didn't give specific examples around your capacity building question, Alyssa. Two things come to mind. One, even long before TBP was codified in a framework and an organization, back in 2018, a strong partner of ours, the Candida Fund, already had made the decision, 2017, that, they were going to sunset by this year. And in that process of sunsetting, they've been such a strong partner of ours. They're one of my brainstorming BFFs. They decided that with all of their grantees in their portfolio, they were really going to look at their fundraising. They were going to look at the bank assets. And when they asked us for these things, we were like, ooh, are we in trouble? But the exercise really that they did, because they knew that they would sunset and have discretionary funds that they want to get rid of, right? And sunset means they're spending down the foundation. They analyze all of their grantees' operational capacity and financial health, right? And what they came away with was a tailored plan for each grantee and how we can support you beyond the check, or with an additional check, or the things that you need that will outlive our legacy. So what did that mean for Common Future? It meant when they looked at us, they were like, oh, you only have about just half a year's of runway funds in your operating reserves. You need an additional board designated reserves to weather you through a storm. And this is 2017, long before the pandemic. And we want to capitalize that. And not only that, we realize that your fundraising is very lean. It's a one-woman shop that time. We want to see how to mobilize your board and mobilize individual giving in a way that supports beyond the check, and be the funder organizer for that. So when lo and behold, in one of their parting capacity building support for Common Future, they provided us with a $1 million support for our reserves, that bolstered our reserves at that time, and also helped become a funder organizer to activate other family offices and to activate our board in a way that they hadn't been activated and engaged before. So it almost doubled that contribution, and just amplified us and validated us in a way that we couldn't have done singularly, right? So that's one concrete example. The other one I have is, since Common Future has moved into the intermediary space of being both a nonprofit receiving funds and also deploying grants and investments, one of the things that we put out last year, and very proud of, is at some point in my rabbit hole desk research, I did an analysis of our grant agreements. All the grant agreements, all the funding agreements that we've received from funders. And what we realized is, no matter how trustful that relationship was, when it came to the process of a grant agreement, the nonprofit, meaning us, almost always never had power. We never had power to negotiate that contract, to negotiate that agreement, to amend or add clauses, especially because we're a race and class explicit organization, to be very explicit about those things. And that just blew my mind. So as an intermediary, we began to even interrogate, was there a space to have an open source document around equitable grant agreements where nonprofits can pull clauses and really share with funders and being like, hey, we're not going to participate in your performative PR cycles and be tokenized. Or, hey, if you need data and metrics in depth, please be considerate of the metrics that matter and come up with those in collaboration with our organization. If you're asking us for financial transparency in terms of audits, pays, P&Ls, and all of that, we require the same for you in terms of financial transparency and where your monies are and how it's being deployed. And to be honest, like, we were so surprised, like my team and I, that was really behind this agreement too and shepherding it, and how it, positively it was received, and yet how confounded funders were and how to implement it in the back of the house, because it was not a process they were considering as part of equitable trust-based relationships, is the process of payments and the process of grant making. And that just blew our minds.
I appreciate, Rakiba, you also bringing it back to a little bit around, well, obviously, I see a lot of this work is rooted in humility and collaboration. And on the collaboration piece that you just shared, like, there's a lot around the metrics too that I think you're naming in that relationship of like coming up with those together. And then also really trusting the community, because as Maya said, you don't know what you don't know, right? It's like, we're all sort of in this together. So why wouldn't we all sit at the table and listen to those that are closest to the work, to come up with those types of metrics? And so that does change the structure, I think, also too. I mean, I'm very curious as this movement grows, what foundations and funds and entities in the philanthropy world will actually look like, and what the job descriptions will be maybe 10 or 15 years from now as this evolves, because it's very different in sort of who is showing up to do the new, to be the new ecosystem builders, more so than maybe the transactional piece of it. I want to just share, kind of as we go into Q&A, I want to invite everyone to please put some questions in the chat. I know Disha is helping me sort of monitor that, so please add some questions. We'll shift to Q&A in a few minutes. I am really always, ever since I was like a little girl, I've always thought 10 or 15 years out, like 12. And I'm like, what's going to happen when I'm in my 20s? Now I'm in my mid 30s, and I'm like, what's going to happen by the time I'm 50? So as we think about that future state and planning, I do want to talk a little bit about not necessarily moving beyond, but adding to and evolving out of trust-based philanthropy, and what that might potentially look like for each of you as individuals, or maybe your organization, the work that you do, the path that you're on. And I'll just share, just maybe to prompt some ideas and give our speakers a second to think on that question. I'll just share that one of the things that's been coming up a lot in my work is to help organizations, again, as we try to decolonize the communities that we all serve, is really thinking about asset holding and helping them participate in the ownership economy and giving back land and helping them accrue assets and build community wealth again. I'm working with a group of BIPOC midwives that are seeking to open their own real estate holdings company because they want to own and operate all their own care campuses and birth centers. So just as we think about that sort of evolution, and obviously there's all these practices, and philanthropy is the catalytic capital and the heart-centered partner to be a part of that work. What for each of you does that sort of moving beyond or adding to, evolving out of trust-based philanthropy look like? So does anybody want to go first? I know it's like a very large question on a Friday.
I think I can go. For us, again, we are a traditional family foundation grant, that are investing in all sorts of different mid-sized organizations or large organizations. But I think the social innovator piece, the piece of social entrepreneurs, and understanding that they have some of those answers, they are closest to the problems or the issues, and how do we support them more is probably something that we are going to be evolving to. And we're trying to get the next gen involved as well, because I think that's something that speaks to them. And that's something that they feel like they're connected to. So how do we find that opportunity? How do we get them to understand the space, educate, awareness? All of those things are the next steps that we're taking to see what the next 5-10 years looks like for us, and how do we get there faster. We always want to run, we try. Sometimes we stumble and we fall, but I think there's a way that we can get there that can bring, and I'm always looking at the next gen, because that's who's going to be stepping into my shoes at some point. And so how do I make them aware of that? And I think that's how I look at the next 5-10 years. And also, humanizing the organizations and strengthening them. How do we, speak to them on the table, around the table, and not make them feel like they're, don't have a voice. I think that's one of the biggest things that we've really shifted and changed. And it's just the process, or it's the approach, or whatever you want to call it. I don't know. It's just how do we get there in the most efficient way is what I want to find. And I also want to do larger grants, also more 5-10 year grants. And that's something that we have not done. This is the first one with Rebuild, is our 5-year grant. How do I get to 10 years? What does that look like for me? And how do I be there for them? So those are the ways that I'm thinking about our future.
I love that, Maya. One of my favorite funds is the Black Feminist Fund in the US, and I think they do 8-year grants. And so it's interesting because I think that a similar 3, 5, 8-year evolution to how they get in partnership. And I love hearing that that's part of the trajectory. And also just like, how beautiful is that to then focus on all the other ways to support? If you're sort of like, we know that we're going to be here as your investment partner and helping with impact outcomes, but also all the other things that you can do together, which like joy and fun and all of that should also be part of working together as we birth this new world.
And also just with Rebuild, like how that's evolved, what that's going to bring, and how we can actually mobilize so many more organizations and get them the support that they need. So just the whole trend of, okay, it's just not one, because how do we get 500 organizations and support it and get them into an ecosystem that they're talking to each other and they're helping each other and they're getting funders from the outside. And there's this whole, movement that happens, which is, I think, the most exciting part.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Love the ecosystem building frame. Vishal, you want to go next?
Sure. Yeah, I was just reflecting as Maya was speaking, and on the question, it is, I'll be honest, it is hard to think beyond right now, because as Maya was saying, there's so much movement building around trust-based philanthropy that we still need to do, right? And if I think about India specifically, we're just at that early stages and at that cusp of growing momentum for this kind of philanthropy, and it's and you have different pools of philanthropy in the Indian landscape, and high net worth and family philanthropy has been the fastest growing and in some ways the most exciting. But there's a lot of corporate social responsibility. There's corporate philanthropy, and some of the ways that the regulations around that whole pool of philanthropy, which is corporate social responsibility, which is also growing and also like a third of the pie in the conversation, right? Has unfortunately, because of different reasons and regulation, been moving in the direction of being more restrictive, right? Less trust based in some ways. So there's definitely a lot more to be done in growing this movement and momentum, right? Specifically in the Indian context. So we will, continue to remain hard at it. I think, and being of course here in the US and trying to always keep eyes and ears open for what's happening here and how can we contextualize that, and what's the corollary or what's the parallel in India, and how can you build those bridges between these concepts. I think the whole idea about decolonizing the mind and decolonizing philanthropy, we're definitely not there yet in the Indian context. It's still, as a large country, we're still very much in the wealth generation phase, right? And high net worth, uh, high net worth philanthropy, just high net worth wealth creation is still very new. It's only like a decade or a couple of decades old concept. So it is challenging, but I think that is part of the beyond for us, which is how do we start to create awareness around wealth and have conversations around how wealth is being generated in the first place? What kind of harm is being created, while that wealth is being created, should we even go in that direction of having such concentrated wealth in the first place? And how do we, work towards different systems and processes that don't allow that and have more distribution and more equality, rather than in some ways following, the US model or other models? So I think we're sort of moving in that direction of generating more wealth, concentrating it more, and then giving it away in a more trust-based manner. But we've got the opportunity to not, right, to learn from how things have happened and not just go in that direction. But we're not, those conversations are actually not yet happening, Alyssa, to your question, right? That's the beyond. But it's difficult to to think about that and to start doing that right now, because there's so much of the basic to be done.
I'm so glad you named that, because I do think how we build, how wealth is accrued, is such a core part of why philanthropy does exist. So to kind of my joke earlier in the seminar of trying to put some of the philanthropy out of business, because should those mechanisms exist in the way that they do, or that wealth be accrued in that way to be then have to be just redistributed. So Rakiba, I'll end on you with the question. Go right ahead.
Yeah. I am so glad that you said these things, Vishal and Alyssa, because as I think about what is beyond trust-based philanthropy, the number one thing that comes to mind for me is whatever framework it is, whatever culture and practice it is, it needs to be rooted from the communities that they come from, and it needs to be named and built from the communities that they come from. How I see it from the United States context is, how do we move from a trust-based philanthropy movement into a liberatory philanthropy movement, really interrogating, where that wealth came from, is how we're deploying our funding reparative, is how we're deploying funding even systems oriented, right? Or is it filling gaps and filling holes in the short term? And really, to get there, you need to have a liberatory mindset that is rooted in the history of our communities in the United States. But that's going to look drastically different for a place like India and elsewhere, where you're going through wealth accumulation, and philanthropy right now is a give back. But how do you change that into a whole new different operating system? What I'm advocating for is that new operating system of philanthropy 2.0 or whatever 3.0 isn't just globally north centered. It's actually coming from the cultures and people that where this philanthropy is expressed, right? So I see that is happening for moving beyond this TBP framework. The other thing I want to reflect on, and I'm so glad, Maya, you talked about 10 years, right? This whole notion of overhead or of like 1 year unrestricted and okay is not okay. When we look at systems change and when we look at longitudinal change, it takes decades, right? So how can we commit to that in a manner that is trustful and in a manner that is dignified? I'm really looking at the longitudinal element of it and being more explicit in that longitudinal, and only a very handful of funders really think in that 5, 8, 10-year terms. And then lastly, really thinking about return. What do I mean? So we talked a lot about value, trust, risk, who is worthy, who is not, and how to do that. But one of the dark, dirty words in our space and our ecosystem is return. We're still expecting a return on investment, even for grant dollars, social return on investment in quantified metrics that the funders have come away with. Is that the direction we want to head? And then when we go into impact investments or other spaces, right, the return is still exorbitant and it's still extractive, right? So when we think about what is the return for risk capital, for doing good work, for social change, for systems change, we really have to be deeply interrogative and deeply reflective about if that's also not exacerbating the inequities that we're fighting as philanthropic offices, as nonprofits, as foundations.
All right, so I want to hang out with you all on Zoom now until like 7 o'clock tonight Eastern time, because this is such a rich, awesome conversation. But I'm mindful that we are up against 5 minutes remaining. I'm going to do, I know we have one question in the chat, which I'll just end on around how we can all stay connected. And Disha, that might be good for you to field on sort of what the next steps are from today and how folks can be connected to our panelists, myself and others on the call. But I'm just going to say yes to the new operating system, yes to challenging language and terminology, shifting our mindsets and working to shift the mindsets of those around us. Being aware in each cultural context of how we show up and define philanthropy and move through processes around it, how we give organizations and partners more of a voice so everyone feels seen and heard, and then also how do we really transition to working together to all become ecosystem builders. So those are some of my golden nuggets from today, and grateful for you all. I will end on asking each of you if there's one tangible thing that folks leaving today, and it can be for a person in a specific role, a fundraiser, a funder, a director, a volunteer, whatever folk might be on the call to receive that. What's one tangible action? Because I think it's good to, as we're all in reflective end of year mode, think a little bit about what's that maybe one thing that you could do in the next couple of weeks that could maybe move you forward in your exploration of trust-based philanthropy. So Rakiba, can I go back to you? Go ahead.
Trust-based philanthropy may seem like common sense. It is in many ways, and elusive at the same time. Like, how do I take this back to what I'm doing as a fundraiser or as a foundation? So one of the things that I'd like to reflect on and say, like, what can you uniquely do in the position that you are? So if you are a funder, is there a small practice within your organization, whether that's payment processing, whether that's your agreements, whether that's something in the back end and technical piece of it that you can really do an audit of and see, hey, is this necessary or is this a procedure formality? We do it for the hell of it, and we might want to change that, right? And if you're a fundraiser, really to like interrogate and look at like, how are you coming into conversations with funders? What are you presenting? Are the relationships that you're engaging with on the transactional and tokenized element, or are you authentically in discussion? And what would it take to get there? You know, there's a lot of fear there. I understand that. But what would it take to get to those authentic conversations, relationships? And can you model that in one or two ways with the current relationships you have in your docket? So those are the two pieces that I would say a call to action.
Thank you. Maya, you want to go next?
Sure. I think for me, it's like, you know, if you're a funder, why don't you start small? You know, if you are afraid, if you don't know how to take the next steps, and everything that Rakiba is saying is like, yes, those are the things that you can do in all of those approaches and processes, but take a risk, be bold. Why not? You know, what's stopping you? And if there is something, learn about it, talk to somebody, talk to one of us, you know, and see if there's some way of understanding this better, and then taking that risk and being bold. Those are the two things I would do.
Thank you, Maya. Vishal, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, really quickly, and hopefully really simple, but easier said than done. I think the one thing for our for our civil society leaders, nonprofit leaders here in this setting is, just start asking questions of your donors, right? Flip it a little bit, and I think you'll find that starts to level the field and the conversation, because these things tend to be very directionally, very one way. Even when there's openness for the funders to answer questions, it's just flexing that muscle, and that helps us get there. And I think the one quick thing for all the donors here is get proximate, right? Let's leave behind the artificial distance that we create, and let the humanity take center stage and flourish. And then we start to see how rewarding all of this actually is. And then the more traditional ways of thinking about return on your philanthropic investments start to like fizzle away and dilute. And it's really more about the human connections. And I think that's going to make more of this kind of philanthropy happen.
Well, thank you all. I think this was an incredible conversation. I hope everyone, all 40 or 50 folks that tuned in throughout the course of the hour, got a lot out of it. I am grateful as we kind of wrap up today. I want to obviously put put a plug in there for the Trust-Based Philanthropy platform and website, so you can head there and kind of download some of these resources. And I also want to just, because Vishal, you sort of ended on this, I do want to say that I feel like this is the time, as one of my colleagues used to say, to be an athletic listener. Like, it is time to ask the questions that make your ears sweat. and so I just named that because I do think that, again, not that there are, I feel like sometimes we really talk about this work through the different sides and seats at the table and who's where with access to what. And I think for anyone, no matter what role you play in this space, of trying to create a better future for all of the communities that we care about as a global human family, I think it is time to ask different questions in different spaces and places. And again, I feel like one of the big shifts I've made, and maybe it's just also after 2 birth experiences, would give you a whole lot of power and agency as a birthing person over here, but is that I'm not afraid when I know I'm asking the right questions when my hands shake and they're a little sweaty and I feel the sweat on the back of my neck. And the anxiety in my belly, that's how I know I'm birthing the next world with my colleagues and friends in this work. So don't be afraid to ask those questions. Please reach out to all of us on the panel if you have questions around anything that was mentioned here today. And just huge gratitude to Vishal, Maya, and Rakiba for being a part of this dialogue. And I will hand it back to you, Disha, to wrap it up.
Thank you so much. And honestly, I think one thing is going to be common with all of us is we're going to be walking away with so many reflections and so many nuggets to just use and keep in our mind as well as we progress forward in this sector, in this field. Super helpful and super thankful to the panelists as well for taking out the time, and for all of you for joining in. Just a quick few things. As we are wrapping up, I definitely would like to share that post the session, the recordings, the resources, every single reflection that our panelists have spoken about, we have captured it all and it will be sent out to you so that you can learn and apply it even further. Along with that, as we come to an end, there's a short poll that's going to come up on the screen. It's going to take a minute, not even more than a minute. It's right there on your screen right now. Please feel free to just fill it up so that we can work and improve these spaces so much better for our audiences and create more learning experiences. So thank you so much for joining in. Thank you, Alyssa. Thank you, Rakiba. Thank you, Maya. And thank you, Vishal, for taking out this time. Cannot be just any more grateful, but thank you so much. And thank you for everyone who's filling out the poll as well. You also deserve a round of applause and a round of thanks.
And as you're filling out the poll, we just want to encourage, a few of you are not Catalyst 2030 members, so feel free. We'll put in the link, Catalyst 2030, if you want to join us in the network. We're a global movement of social entrepreneurs from around the world. And lastly, I did put in the chat, we do have a crowdsourced grant writing document that we're working on. So if you know of any other funders that are out there, you can add it to the list, and we'll eventually get it where you can organize it and search it, etc. But what we found is it's so inequitable that a lot of these organizations have it behind a paywall wall, and you have to pay thousands of dollars to access who's the grantors around the world. So at Catalyst, we tried to take that down, and we started to put all the funders that we know of into a document, but we just haven't had the manpower to clean it up a little. But feel free to add other funding organizations as well. But thank you all. And as you leave, please unmute, say goodbye to our speakers and thank them in the Catalyst manner. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for joining in.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Here, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, speakers. We appreciate you all. We can close or stay. I think we can close.
We can close it, yeah. Thank you, Debbie. Thanks, Mariam.